Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to another one of our weekly TESS seminars. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Noel Priest as our speaker today. Noel and his wife, Penny Van Oosterzee, have been very involved with TESS right from a very beginning, and which is going back more than 10 years now. So, but they've been engaged and they've been involved, and they've come to every single one of our annual conferences, and they come to our seminars, and they engage to ask questions and all that. So they're really almost models for the kinds of adjunct type members that we love to have at TESS. So terrific to have them doing so much work. Now, Noel received his PhD at Charles Darwin University. He's got a lot of, I won't mention all the different endangered species hubs and other kinds of groups that he's involved with very actively here in Australia. One thing that he's done a lot of work on has been on declining fauna of the Cape York Peninsula. And this has been some very interesting work that he and his colleagues have been doing. Noel's published over 200 papers, which is a fantastic total for anybody. So it's really a terrific indication of how productive and how sharp he's been, how wonderfully focused he's been on his work. So anyway, the title of Noel's talk is "The Crisis is Not Averted. Monitoring Failures and Government Decisions Leave North Queensland Mammals in Peril." Whoops. I think whoops has got an H in it. Does whoops have an H? That'd be pig.
Pedantry was maybe your finest point, Bill. Thank you very much for coming to this seminar. Appreciate your attendance. Today I'm going to talk about this crisis that Bill read out. We're in quite a difficult situation. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I work, the elders past and present and emerging. I think they're providing an incredible contribution to what we value, but a lot of their country is in trouble as well. The northern savannas, where I've worked for 30 or so years, support an incredible variety of fauna. And I'm going to focus today on the mammals, the species and subspecies. There are about 180 species and subspecies of mammals across the region, or there were. There are 55 species of bat, 39 rat, 1 dingo, 84 species of marsupial, and 2 of monotremes. Now, I've been involved with in studying and working with these species for all that time. In fact, my record going back dealing with species goes back to the early 70s in Kosciuszko and on the south coast. Oops, this one's just dropped off. There's a bit wobbly. This is Kylie Harvey holding a northern koala on a place called Gun Point in Northern Territory. We did some trapping up there for industrial development, and we caught this koala back in 2001. I think that was the last record for the Gun Point region. We also caught them on the Moyle River and other places in the Northern Territory, and we did some work in WA as well, Western Australia in the far west, and caught some there. They're still extant in the WA region, in the Kimberley region, but the areas we trapped them in at Gun Point and other places, in fact places like southern Kakadu, where we used to get lots, so many that we would get really pissed off with them because they'd foul the traps. We'd walk down from the top of a 300-metre ridge, rocky country, down to the river, wash the traps out and carry them all the way back and reset them. So we got really pissed off with northern koalas in those days. That's in the early 90s. They don't exist there anymore. In the period that Europeans have been in Australia, we've seen the extinction of a number of species. 2 of the bats are endangered, 3 are vulnerable, 2 of the rats are actually extinct. 1 is critically endangered, 2 are endangered, and 7 are vulnerable. Dingo's sort of okay in some places, but it's being shot out and poisoned out wherever graziers find them trouble. In fact, in Queensland, they're not protected. The marsupials are not doing particularly well either. 2 extinct, 3 critically endangered, 13 endangered, and 7 are vulnerable, and 1 is near threatened. The monotremes. Oops, there are a couple of wobbly ones there. This year we had a paper published in the journal Diversity. James Fitzsimons and I pulled together a lot of information from a lot of researchers across Northern Australia, examining where we were with fauna, focused on mammal, but we did look at other species as well, other taxa as well. And James from the Nature Conservancy, I should mention. And I documented and tabulated what had happened since a paper that Mark Zimbecki and others, including myself, wrote in 2015. So this is just 7 years. What we did was tabulate all these known species to look at their status now, to see what had actually changed. And in the journal paper, we actually retained these red pointers to say these are the changes that have occurred. That's against their normal rules, but we said no, we insisted we wanted to have these highlighted because the changes have occurred just in 7 years. There are 29 more species listed on the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act in 7 years. That's on top of the ones that were already on that list. This afternoon, I'm going to focus on just 2 species groups for a discussion point because they're quite interesting rather than go through all the species that are on the list. Just these 2 are of quite some interest. I'll focus first on the black-footed tree rat, where there are 3 subspecies, and then on northern quoll, which is still described as 1 species on the VPPC Act. And there are 2, 3, 4 subspecies across Northern Australia, actually described fairly recently, but not adjusted under the VPPC Act. This is the black-footed tree rat. The photo's courtesy of Martin Willis, a friend of mine. They're gorgeous rats. They're big, they're giants. They're like the white-tailed rats you see around here. Very intelligent, fearsome animals. If you approach them the wrong way, if they go for your finger, watch out for your arm because they are tough. They can be really vicious. But they are also amazingly gentle if you approach them the right way and you don't scare them. You can actually feed them. I've seen people with them on their shoulders, ones that have been caught in the wild where they've been injured. They're friendly. They're just delightful, intelligent creatures. And yet they're in trouble. In the Kimberley and Northern Territory region, there's a subspecies called Gouldii. It's been uplisted from not listed at all under the EPBC Act to endangered now. In the Northern Territory, it's considered endangered. On the right of that table, you'll see a summed monitoring score. That score is out of 45. It was a monitoring score that was developed by John Winarski and a number of others to look at how well these species are monitored. So the Northern Territory one, Kimberley one, is reasonably well monitored, 16 out of 45. That doesn't sound high, but it's probably better than a lot. The Melville Island one is slightly better monitored because there's more researchers going there from Charles Darwin Uni and other places, northern hubs and so on. It's reasonably monitored. The North Queensland one, Ratoides, is apparently not monitored. I couldn't find any papers on it. And there's no record. And the paper we wrote last year, a couple of years ago, we investigated what monitoring was going on in Cape York and Northern Queensland, and there's bugger all really. So the 3 assessments, endangered in the Northern Territory Kimberley, vulnerable under the Melville Island, are based on reasonable monitoring. And yet the one in Northern Queensland is based on what? The 3 subspecies distributed quite widely. They're separated by essentially biogeographic barriers and very, very large areas of land or sea. Melville Island one is exclusive to Melville Island. The top end, the Kimberley one, is found just in that region. That's separate from the Melville Island one. And the Cape York and North Queensland one is found just in that region, fairly restricted, but it still seems to be extant. So we've got reports of them being seen in various places. Now, the reason I started with the black-footed tree rat is because the distinction between what subspecies are recognised and what are not is important for a whole range of reasons. Any ecologist or biologist will know that, that species evolve according to their environments, and these species have been, in some cases, separated for millennia and more than millennia. That's since the sea level came up, and I'll get onto that in a moment. But northern koala is still described as a single species under the EPBC Act and some other legislation. Now, like the black-footed tree rat, it was described early in the 19th century, late in the early 19th century and early in the 20th century, as 3 distinct subspecies, as was the northern koala. It was described as 4 subspecies originally. Then it was conflated into one species, and then later it was expanded again and then conflated. We're now in a situation where the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act lists it as one species, which is endangered. The Northern Territory population of that subspecies, I say population because it's still described as a population, is listed as critically endangered in Northern Territory. The same species is said to be endangered in WA in one location, but not listed in the Pilbara. Yet they're very, very different environments. These things keep wobbling, don't they? The Queensland subspecies is relatively poorly monitored. That 12 in the brackets there is an assessment based on what prior knowledge there was. There's no monitoring going on, it's just prior knowledge. And that's what we had to do in this situation. It's of least concern in Queensland, yet we have no basis for knowing that, really. We've got some documented evidence of populations around the Walsh Range and around the wind farm there. There are anecdotal reports of populations and lots of animals around, the Cooktown area, and Black Mountain and so on, and they're reported there regularly. So we think that there's reasonable populations there, but we don't really know because there's no serious scientific monitoring going on. So the Halicartus in the territory is still described as just Dasyurus halicartus, as endangered and critically endangered in the Northern Territory. And that doesn't reflect what's happening elsewhere. And that's really important because frequently we talk about reintroductions. And if we try to reintroduce a species from an environment on the tip of Cape York to the Northern Territory, which is very different, not only is it likely to cause problems with survival, because it's a very different environment, it could be extended to other areas, but it also causes problems with genetic diversity, because if you're introducing a very different genome from one area to another, and we don't know what those factors might be because there's no studies on it, it leaves us with a problem. In 2015, Pat Woolley and Mike Westerman and Mike Krajewski, they analysed the genetics of the Dasyurus, all the Dasyurus, and the Halicartus fell out very clearly into 4 subspecies, and they've supported the original split. And it's now accepted that there are 4 subspecies. One is not named yet. That's another wobbly one. Oops. The 4 subspecies are separated really clearly. The Pilbara population, that's a desert. It's a rocky, sandy, spinifex desert. It's hot as Hades, and it gets just a intermittent rainfall. It happens occasionally. It's certainly not seasonal. It seems to be a reasonably stable population because there's monitoring going on with the mining operation, and reports come out. There's no papers come out yet, but there's reports coming out, and I've got those data. There is one paper coming out fairly soon, I believe, but like all papers, they can take a lot longer than you expect initially. The other population, in the Kimberley is separated by the Ord River, sort of a barrier. And that's the barrier between the Northern Territory and the Kimberley populations, subspecies. The Northern Territory population is the one that has actually almost disappeared. There's still some on Untitled, which is the Brute Island, which is, can I point this thing closely? Not really. In the middle of that, that's Brute Island. It's seems to be a reasonably stable population there. It's being monitored all the time. The Indigenous rangers on Untitled actually control cane toads. They check every boat and every vehicle that comes into the island to make sure they do not get on the island. And that seems to be working because the koala population is still okay there. The Queensland population, however, again, separated by a very large, very big gap called the Carpentaria Gap. It's both an arid barrier and a flood barrier that separates those populations. There's no cross-fertilisation. In the EPBC legislation that on their website, it showed originally that the halicartus occurred virtually linked together across the whole region. But that's the real picture. That's how it shows. That's how it is. There's huge gaps between these subspecies. So there's not much intermingling. Oh, another one gone. Yep. There goes the hairy-nosed wombat. One of the gliders, another one. Yeah. So we've got a situation where the status of these animals listed under the legislation, which is the sort of the driving force to say this, we have to do something about this, is not reflective of the biology and the zoology and the ecology of these species. And just, I think that's a really important fact to note. So we've got these 4 subspecies with very different statuses, with actually limited knowledge on all but the Northern Territory species. And yet we've known about these things for a very long time, and yet we're still not doing the monitoring. We've known Australia's fauna extinction crisis has been going for many decades. For the last 2+ decades, we've known that it's been hitting Northern Australia. We didn't expect that until we started to notice changes in the early 1990s. And by the time the paper that was published in 2001, which I'll get to, it was obvious that there's another one. That was Bramble Camillani's story go. So we've known about this since 2001, and it's been published in proper journals. It's not hidden in reports or anything. Then in 2007, there was another paper came out that talked about species lost from our landscape. It's actually a book. It's a nice little book. It's sad. But then in 2011, James Fitzsimons and others wrote a paper called Into Oblivion and documented the same sort of thing that was documented before, showing the list of the species and their status. Then in 2015, Mark Zembecki and a group of us got together and re-documented what was going on. And so it was an update. We didn't actually track what had happened since the last publication, but it's pretty clear that the things have been added to this list of species. One of the things that sort of drives us is, well, how do we know these things? Well, it's monitoring. We get out and monitor, and a number of you here have been doing that sort of work. Steve Williams is doing it all the time. It's sometimes not considered to be serious research, but it is really important research. In fact, if it's done the right way, it can be incredibly valuable. So the monitoring that's been done has been done mostly in the Northern Territory. And again, I'll get to that in a moment, but it's really systematic monitoring, and it goes back 30 years. When we find that a species is sort of starting to disappear, we can actually focus on what's happening to that individual species or the group of species by targeted monitoring and research. And then the problem there is that there's so little being done in the region. Across Northern Australia, the primary source of information for all that legislation that's been documented, all the tabulation in the EPBC lists of species and the documented changes are based on mostly these study sites, which go back 30 or so years. They're in the Nitmiluk, Kakadu and Litchfield National Parks. So they're all in national parks, which means that they're sort of semi-protected. Kakadu's got a bit of a problem with buffalo, but they're snapshots of that very small part of the region. They do not account for this region at all, or the subspecies that are found there, nor for this region at all. They don't account for any of the biogeographic regions outside that Kakadu, Litchfield and Nitmiluk. In more recent years, for the last decade or so, in the Kimberley, Ian Radford and Ben Corey and others from DBC, the Department of Biodiversity Conservation and Attractions, have been monitoring sites for fauna for the last 5 to 10 years. So good luck and full credit to them, because they've actually done a marvellous job in trying to build that knowledge base up. What do we need to do to change this situation where we've got this complete absence of monitoring for a very large portion of the savannas? In fact, I could probably add it to for a large proportion of Australia. First, I think we need to implement the EPBC Samuel review. You might have heard of that. It's a very thorough review, and Graham Samuel has made some thoroughly good, sound recommendations to change the legislation to do a whole range of things, but one of the most important is accountability to politicians and decision makers, so that they're responsible for making decisions that might jeopardise species. Second thing we need to do, I think, is to restore budgets. I'll get onto that in the next slide, but our budgets have been cut quite substantially. We need to establish monitoring sites in biogeographic regions across the savannas. I'm not saying we have to do all of them. The Gulf Plains are, for instance, seldom bother. It's pretty sad days when you go out night after night getting zero trap rate. So it's not much fun. But other regions we should be monitoring. We should be establishing proper monitoring program for these areas. We're talking about pretty trivial sorts of amounts of money. Luke Ireland and Graham Gillespie and co actually have examined this for the last 5 years or so, really thoroughly, and modified the Northern Territory trapping program. Instead of having so many sites, they've reduced the number of sites so they can increase the frequency and intensity of trapping to get better power from the statistics, because the trouble is that the records from the monitoring up to date can detect a gross change. So if you've got a species that's abundant, 10 years later it's disappeared, you can't pick up what the trend is. And picking up trends is really important for ecological management. If you're going to do anything about it, you've got to pick up those trends early. If you're starting to disappear, you've got to pick them up early so you can actually take appropriate action. So getting some sites into Cape York and North Queensland would be ideal. The red dots up the top there are those done by Justin Perry and co from CSIRO. They were single surveys. That's just one-off surveys that showed that the numbers of mammals are already low there. And in the Ironsley Uplands and the Gulf Plains, where I've done some work, there's red dots down here. It's the same sort of picture. We're getting what was considered in the Northern Territory to be of extreme concern, basically. But we need to establish places like that as monitoring sites so that we can actually determine what's happening with these populations or subspecies in our regions. And we should be covering as many of the biogeographic regions as we can. Each of these colours indicates a biogeographic region. So we should be actually trying to do a bit more about that, in fact, a lot more about it. And as you can see, it's not huge budgets. But we've seen since 2013, you'll know what date that means, 50% cut in budgets, 50% in environment budget. Brendan Wintle and co did some analysis of what it would take to halt Australia's extinction crisis and found that it's just not that expensive, but we do need to have that, at least those budgets restored to previous levels to even begin to tackle the task of working out what to do with these declining species. ACF, the Australian Conservation Foundation, also looked at that and provided quite rigorous information. And if you go, I don't normally always trust reports coming out, so I went to the budget papers. The budget papers demonstrate that we've lost 50% of the budget from 2013. This is, I'm talking about federal now, but states and territories aren't much better. So I'm just using feds as one example. But it's real. The cuts have been that way. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see that Australia's recovery from the extinction crisis is well underway? We're doing well with COVID, but oh boy, throw them some money. In the US, some studies by Suckling and Taylor examined what happens if you put money into trying to take action to protect species that are facing extinction, going towards extinction. Since 1990, they've been able to delist 19 species of bird, they only concentrate on birds, through conservation actions. So you can actually do it. The trajectories of the others have improved, many of the others. Some are still in trouble, but trajectories of others where they can identify the causes, symptoms, and try to take some action to reverse those declines can be effective if you've got the finance to do intensive conservation actions. It's very clear from a paper very recently back in 2017 in Nature by Anthony Waldron and colleagues that you can predict how well your species are going to go by the investment you put into it. If you cut your budgets, you're going to lose species. It's like you cut them off and you cut them off and they just go. So what's the government doing about this? The Australian Parliament set up a Senate inquiry in 2018, the Senate Environment Communications References Committee. It was due to report by November 2019. Australia's fauna extinction crisis is still going. They gave an interim report in December 2019. It actually looked at the native grasslands that were being poisoned by Angus Taylor, but that's just an interim report. I don't know what's that's got to do with Australia's faunal extinction crisis, but that deadline passed as well. September 2020, deadline passed. November 2021 passed. And the inquiry lapsed for a short time. It was actually on the website saying it had lapsed. And it was due now in May 2022. Guess what? There's an election coming. I can't really see the Senate Environment Communications Reference Committee finishing that report before then. The Ecological Society, we're just about to put an open letter to the Senate Committee asking, requesting, pleading with them to finish that study. It'll be out shortly, it'll be an open letter. So we're in a situation where government's really not coming up to the task. They're really, they're lost in the wilderness. They've been washed away by the floods or burnt by the fires or something. Since 2018, 29 species have been added to the list. That's in the time that the Senate Committee has actually been examining this Australia's fauna extinction crisis. How is that happening? How do you handle a crisis? Clearly they're not, but there are various ways that it seems to be that they're ignoring it, they're defunding it, not accounting for it, pretending they're doing things about it, blame someone else. That's the state's responsibility. It's a territory responsibility. It's not ours. Announce new old money that sounds a lot to people like us. $10 or $100 million sounds a lot, but we're talking about billions for oil companies. I mean, it's just ridiculous. You can take endangered species off the list. I didn't bring the list up, but this one is particularly interesting. The golden-backed tree rat, which I used to see in Northern Territory, I did the last survey to try to find its remaining population in the area we knew it was, and we found nothing back in the mid-1990s. It's gone from the territory. It's listed as critically endangered, but it's been taken off the EPBC list. It's no longer vulnerable, it's just not there. It's not on the list because its population in WA, around the Yampi and the Western Kimberley area, seems to be okay. It's not necessarily okay because there's not much monitoring going on, but it seems to be okay. We saw these things running around the rafters on Kimbolton Homestead on Yampi Station in the far west Kimberley at night, and they were just annoying because they were going all night. They're beautiful animals, but they're just going all night and keeping us awake while we're trying to do fauna surveys in the day. So that's another technique of just sort of absolving yourself of responsibility or abdicating responsibility. And reducing staff, the staff cuts have been quite dramatic. Don't report on it, and generally, what's that say? There are 1,800 species listed on EPBC as threatened, as plants and animals. 550 of them are fauna. Bless their little hearts. Australian government has committed 100 million for priority threatened species. Great news. Look at the dates. 4 years, from 2019 to 2020, through to the financial year 2022-23. Go back to that. It's actually stated there. That's a clip from the website. For 100 priority species. That's all of the 1,800. There are some recovery plans that are being retained, but this is just for the 100 priority species. 20 of them are mammals. We've had 29 listed since 2018 as threatened, increased to endangered or critically endangered. They're going to fund 20 species. That's Australia-wide. That's not just the region I'm talking about now, the northern savannas. This is the whole of Australia. So it was pretty galling yesterday to see an article in the paper about The Guardian. I guess nobody here would read The Guardian, but the federal government committed 62 million in the budget to establish plans, regional plans, so that they can avoid environmental bureaucracy, to reduce the bureaucracy so that it reduces the accountability for developments. 62 million. That's out of a 128 million package to streamline environmental assessments. So they can find the money when they want to, but they're not keen on supporting species that are going to go extinct. Now, I'm not trying to gloss over this. It's really hard to work out what's going on. Detecting declines is troublesome. You need good data, you need good power of statistics, and some really good papers came out recently by Luke Einoder and others looking at the power of the findings, and that's why we know that we need to do better monitoring in different ways. And so the monitoring techniques have changed. Determining causes is even more difficult because you don't know what's causing. There could be a whole range of factors. It could be cats. They're certainly the bogey species at the moment. Cane toads, yeah, sure. They'll kill it. Koala bites it in quite a few animals, quite a few other species, including some of the reptiles. But they're not the primary causes of these. Changed fire regimes have been considered. Overgrazing by cattle and other introduced and feral herbivores. changed ecological conditions, like you look up in the Cape, look at the greater grass and various other grasses that have come in over there, changes the fire regimes entirely and takes out the resources for quite a few of these species. If you get gamba grass, for instance, if you get fires too frequently there, you can actually get rid of your forests and get rid of your tree hollows where a lot of species live. Clearing of natural habitat. Now, that wasn't a problem in the territory of WA so much, although it's increasing. But in Queensland in 2018-19, there was 680,000 hectares cleared. That's across Queensland. Some of it was in northern part of Queensland, just south of Cooktown. 40,000, 50,000 hectares cleared in 1 year, 3-4 years ago. And then, of course, there are diseases that can factor into some of these declines. We don't know much about any of these factors. There's a lot written about it, and a lot of analysis, but we haven't actually been able to come up with the full suite of causes, especially where there are synergies, where things are interacting among each other, among themselves. And then 1.5. I think we all know what 1.5 is. It's Australia's changing climate. We've already reached 1.4, 1.5 degrees in Northern Australia, increase over the average temperature. Our extremes are greater. Darwin, the number of days is 5-6 times greater than it was at really hot, unbearable days. Those extreme days have increased dramatically. And there's plenty of evidence for that, not only NEST, but also the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, IPCC, various other studies that have been done. So how do we overcome some of these challenges? How do we get governments to support what is needed? Why would they when economics rules? For argument, let's say that it just costs $1 million a year for each state and territory for, say, 50 sites, which is what INOTA and Co had been modelling. Dangerous idea to put that small amount forward, but that will be enough to get some monitoring. Excuse me. And in some ways, that sort of investment defrays some of the health and welfare costs that we face in Northern Australia. Huge disenfranchisement of Indigenous people, and Indigenous rangers who I've worked with in all states are inspired by getting out on country and working with people like me who go out and we share information. We teach them how to do fauna trapping in the Western scientific way. They show us all the knowledge about the animals and plants that is so profound and so incredible that it shames me to think that I know so little. But that investment of even $1 million a year for each state would be dramatic improvement and would reduce some of those health and welfare costs. There are papers on this. There's quite a few investigative studies that have shown that getting people in meaningful employment in the regions actually does help. At the moment, there are 2,000 Indigenous rangers supported by the federal government, as far as I know, to the tune of just under $1 billion, around $1 billion. The other thing we need to do is value ecosystem services. We don't have a good value on what is the importance to all of us and all those species of ecosystem services. So what I'm leading to in this talk is we've got to do something about this. The evidence is clear. It has been clear for decades. So I was invited to a Farming Institute advocacy forum. I didn't go because it was too expensive, but we had this presentation by Mitch Hook. He's the former, it's not Mitch Hook, sorry, former chair of the Minerals Council of Australia and zero-till farming advocate. And he said, and this is a really important lesson. Mitch Hook is a very capable, very vocal sort of advocate for his industry. So the biggest advocacy mistake was getting lost in the logic of our own arguments and actually thinking your stuff, I think he said stuff, doesn't stink. You need to establish awareness and interest, not the facts. The facts are essential, I might say. You have to have a good foundational basis for what you're arguing, but it's the way you argue, the way you present your case that's really important. And he says that facts are rarely an effective advancement. You need to connect, build empathy. We need to talk to people. We need to give presentations in plain lingo, write articles. We conservation scientists have a duty to advocate, in my opinion, for the biodiversity we care about. And advocacy can range everywhere from, getting up there and having an argument, debate on TV or radio, right through to doing simple things like working on a recovery team for a species. That's the sort of range of things that you can actually do to help advocate for the species, the ecosystems you care about. Right to elected members when things come up. Sign petitions. It's useful. Get 1,000 or 2,000 signatures to a petition for a particular issue, then that starts to attract the attention of politicians and decision makers. Make submissions to inquiries. As an ecological society, I was on the Ecosystem Science Council, Australasian Bat Society. All these societies make submissions to inquiries. Australia's faunal extinction crisis has 62 submissions, almost all from advocate groups and some individuals, all of them supporting an investigation into Australia's faunal extinction crisis. Every single one of them. Not one submission said, oh, we shouldn't be doing this. There was some equivocation, but there's not one against it. So those submissions actually can work if we keep the pressure up. I'd like to just jump into the spectacle flying fox. This is in my front yard the other night. The spectacle flying fox has now been listed as endangered. Just last year was enlisted as an endangered species. The recovery plan for it was written in 2010 by some bat scientists, quite good for the time. There are a number of things we could change now because with hindsight we needed to have much more specific targets and so on. So from 2010 to 2020, when it finished, it was deemed no longer active by the federal government, and it's actually taken off the web page. The only thing that, well, I should say that in that recovery plan, there were some 20 government departments, councils, societies, organisations, groups, individuals who were identified as people who could do the work or should do the work on the spectacle flying fox. None of them were engaged. They were just listed on the recovery plan. So none of them were actually engaged, tasked with the job, funded, given resources, given direction. There was no recovery team established in that time. We established a recovery team in 2020, at the end of the recovery plan. The only thing that happened under that recovery plan, and this stimulus came from the Fruit Growers Association and agricultural industry to count spectacle flying foxes and little reds and others that were incidentally found. In that time, over the period of 14 years before 2018, population of spectacle flying foxes fell from 326,000 to 75,000. Then, in November 2018, another 23,000 died in one heat event, which ostensibly was a third of the population in one heat event. Through the Humane Society, we've put in a submission to list to critically endangered because we think it is. But the lack of action on that was deplorable. It, first of all, should have been the government who took responsibility for making that plan, putting it into action. But failing that, maybe the scientists who are aware of this issue should have been taking a bit of responsibility. Now it's a group of individuals and the Bat Society and others who are actually taking the action to actually do this. We've got terrain involved, wet tropics, Cairns Regional Council, a number of other councils, the NRM groups, and it's a group of people like this who are actually taking the action to actually try to do something about this. We're trying to describe the vegetation, we're trying to get better population estimates, we're trying to find out where the key risks and colonies colonies are. So my message, my plea in this talk about the crisis that we face in Northern Australia with vulnerable clients, particularly mammals, is that all of us take some action, as small as it might be, just even giving a bit of information to say something like the recovery team for the spectacle flying fox. That would help. Just contribute as much as we can, because if we don't contribute, we're just going to be monitoring to extinction. What concerns me is that in another 5 years, 2027, another 7 years, 2029, another 10 years, when my granddaughter's 20, we'll be reporting the same sorts of trends with mammals and birds and reptiles and frogs across Northern Australia, across Australia, and there will be nothing done about it if we don't take action. And I know that there are arguments against taking advocacy action because it's getting away from our science. Personally, I think we need to be less precious about our science. We need to be really rigorous about our science, but we need to get out and talk about it and tell everybody what we feel about it. Make sure they're aware of the real issues. Thank you.